Ancient Greece left the world with philosophers, temples, and heroic myths. But behind this shiny shell hid another, much darker reality. Among the ruins and legends, shadows lurk that still haunt historians and archaeologists. In the second part of our journey, we will delve into 25 new mysteries that change the way we look at antiquity. The mystery of the Homeric hymns and their hidden meaning. Homer, whose poems Iliad and Odyssey became the foundation of all Greek culture, was not only a bard of heroic wars and wanderings. The so-called Homeric hymns are also attributed to him, poetic works addressed to the gods. At first glance, they look like solemn prayers praising Zeus, Athena, Demeter, or Apollo. But the more closely scientists study these texts, the more they find hints of secret cults, forgotten myths, and mysterious symbols that cannot be deciphered unambiguously. Hymns were common in oral tradition. They were sung by rhapsodists during festivals, sacrifices, and mysteries. Each text began with an invocation to a particular deity, but instead of simple praise, it often contained strange, disturbing images. For example, the hymn to Demeter tells of the abduction of her daughter Persephone by Hades. But hidden within this story are hints at the secret rites of Eleusis, mysteries to which only a select few were initiated. Another hymn to Apollo describes his arrival at Delphi and the slaying of the monster Python, but the text contains lines that suggest this is not just a myth, but an echo of a real ancient ritual of exorcism. The researchers' special attention is drawn to the fact that the hymns contain symbols and epithets that are not found in other sources. Some lines look like a cipher, as if the authors deliberately hid the true meaning from the uninitiated. For example, the goddess Hera is called "she who dwells at the crossroads," which is much closer to the image of Hecate, the dark goddess of magic and night. Other hymns describe strange sounds coming from altars, or mention black sacrifices, which usually referred to chthonic deities. What is also surprising is that the hymns often contradict the official versions of the myths. Aphrodite is portrayed not only as a goddess of love, but also as a force of destruction and madness. Hermes is depicted not just as a cunning thief, but as the ruler of the boundary between the living and the dead. These dark shades of imagery create the feeling that the hymns have preserved an older, archaic layer of belief that was later supplanted by classical religion. There is an assumption that the hymns were used in secret rituals. They could be a kind of key to understanding the mysteries. Each name, each metaphor, revealed hidden meanings to the initiates. Thus, the hymn to Demeter was probably part of a rite symbolizing the death and rebirth of nature, and the hymn to Apollo was a ritual of purification. To outsiders, these were just beautiful songs, but to those who knew the secret, they became codes leading to deeper knowledge. Modern scholars are trying to compare the Homeric hymns with archaeological finds. For example, inscriptions and symbols resembling individual lines of the hymns have been found in the ruins of temples. Sometimes they match so precisely that it seemed as if the text had been created specifically for a specific sanctuary. This suggests that the hymns were part of practical magic, combining word and action. The origin of these texts also remains a mystery. If the Iliad and Odyssey are by Homer, then the hymns were probably written by different authors, united by a common tradition. But why were they attributed to Homer? Perhaps because his name became a symbol of sacred wisdom, and texts that seemed too dangerous or incomprehensible were covered by the authority of the great poet. The time of their creation is no less mysterious. Some hymns clearly date back to archaic centuries, while others may have been added later. But they all retain traces of an ancient magical tradition that the Greeks themselves tried not to advertise. In this sense, the hymns can be called the shadow side of Greek religion. They reveal what was usually hidden behind the facade of majestic temples and official sacrifices. Today, the Homeric hymns read like a collection of riddles. They give the sense that behind the simple words there is another world, a world where the gods not only bless but also punish, where ritual is not a celebration but a test. It is this duality that makes them so compelling. The mystery of the hymns is that they are simultaneously understandable and incomprehensible. We can translate every word, but we cannot fully comprehend their essence. Perhaps this is intended. The texts were left as a test for posterity, as a challenge to our understanding, and the more we study them, the more we feel that the ancients knew more than they were willing to tell. The ghosts of Thermopylae are the shadows of fallen Spartans. The Battle of Thermopylae in 481 BC became a symbol of courage when 300 Spartans and their allies stopped Xerxes' army at a narrow pass. But behind the majestic image of the feat lies a dark layer of legends that have haunted the imagination of the Greeks for centuries. The site of this battle became not only a monument to heroism, but also a place where, according to stories, the shadows of fallen warriors came to life at night. Ancient authors mention that in the years following the battle, locals and travelers heard strange sounds in the Thermopylae Gorge, spears striking shields, heavy tramping of feet, and battle cries. These noises arose suddenly, usually on moonless nights, and died down as abruptly as they began. Those who witnessed them claimed that these were not ordinary natural noises. There was no one in the mountains except for the occasional shepherd, and the cries were heard so clearly as if the battle was still going on. A special place in these legends was occupied by stories about ghostly figures. Sometimes in the fog one could see the silhouettes of Spartans in helmets with crests and with spears in their hands. They walked in formation, and sometimes it seemed that they were fighting an invisible enemy. These visions were accompanied by an unbearable feeling of fear, and many eyewitnesses claimed that after meeting them, they fell ill or died within a year. The inhabitants of the nearby villages believed that the souls of the warriors remained to guard the passage. For them, this was not a curse, but a blessing. The spirits of the heroes did not allow the enemies to penetrate Hellas again. Therefore, memorial mounds were erected on the site of the battle, where sacrifices were made annually. But the rituals had a dual nature. On the one hand, there was veneration. On the other, an attempt to appease the restless souls. The Greek religious tradition perceived heroes as beings on the border between humans and gods. They could help the living, but they could also take revenge if they felt forgotten. Therefore, the stories about the ghosts of Thermopylae can be understood as a warning. Great feats cannot be turned into a simple legend. Otherwise, the souls of the fallen will remind of themselves in the most terrible way. Modern historians suggest that these legends may have arisen from a combination of psychological and natural factors. The narrow passage surrounded by mountains creates special acoustics. The wind passing through the crevices can really sound like metal strikes. And the constant presence of the memory of a bloody battle reinforced the impression and made people hear more than was actually there. But even if some of it is explained by nature, the very strength of the legends suggests that the Greeks perceived Thermopylae as a sacred place, where the boundary between worlds was thinner than usual. There is also a more mystical version. Some ancient authors believe that the ghosts of Thermopylae appear when Hellas is in danger. Thus, during the Peloponnesian War, there were rumors that the shadows of the Spartans appeared again, warning of impending troubles. Similar stories arose during the Macedonian and Roman invasions. The ghosts became not only a memory of the past, but also a sign of the future. Archaeologists confirm that the battle site was revered for centuries. The remains of sacrificial fires, vessels with wine and oil, and figurines of warriors were found on the Spartan burial mound. This means that people really believed in the presence of spirits and tried to interact with them. For ancient man, ghosts were not a fantasy, but a part of reality that could be felt and even propitiated. The mystery of Thermopylae is that history and myth are intertwined especially closely here. We know that the battle was real, that the Spartans really did fight to the end, but the myth of the ghosts has transformed their feat into an eternal presence. Now, they are not only heroes of the past, but also guardians of the present, shadows that remind us that courage does not die with the body. Today, when travelers pass through this place, they see only a road framed by mountains. But even now, many say that there is a special silence and tension here, as if the land remembers every step of the warriors. And perhaps this feeling is the true presence of the ghosts of Thermopylae. Not figures in the fog, but memory itself, transformed into the breath of history that lives on in this narrow passage. Mysterious cults of the underground rivers Acheron and Styx. For the ancient Greeks, rivers were not only a source of water and life, but also mystical boundaries separating the world of the living from the kingdom of the dead. Among them, Acheron and Styx occupied a special place. These underground streams were perceived as gates to Hades, through which souls left the earth and passed into another world. Legends and rituals associated with them gave rise to cults, traces of which archaeologists still find today. The Acheron, which flowed through Epirus, was known as the River of Sorrow. In ancient texts, it is mentioned as the path along which Charon transported the souls of the dead. But for the locals, this was not just a myth. At the foot of the mountain, where the river disappeared into crevices and flowed underground, there was a necromantian, a sanctuary where priests performed rituals of communication with the dead. Visitors made sacrifices, drank special concoctions, and immersed themselves in the darkness of underground corridors, while priests created visions of spirits. Many believed that it was here that one could hear the voices of deceased relatives or receive prophecies from shadows. The Styx had an even more sinister reputation. Mentioned in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the river was considered the most sacred and terrible oath of the gods. Any Olympian who swore an oath by the Styx and broke his word was doomed to death or exile. In Arcadia, there was a spring that was identified with the source of the Styx. Its water was icy and deadly poisonous. According to legends, even bronze and iron corroded when dipped in this liquid. Priests used Styx water in rituals associated with the punishment of oath breakers, and sometimes in secret initiations to show the power of divine wrath. The local cults of both streams had a common feature. They were associated not with joy, but with fear and propitiation. People came to Acheron and Styx not for holidays, but to propitiate the underground forces. They brought black animals, lowered sacrificial vessels into the water, whispered the names of ancestors. All this was done with the feeling that behind the thin line of water there was another world, ready to interfere in the lives of mortals. Modern archaeologists confirm that traces of cult pits where sacrifices were made were found at the sources of the Acheron. Vessels presumably used in rituals were discovered in the vicinity of the Styx, but the exact content of the rituals remains a mystery. The texts are silent on the details, and the artifacts found only increase the sense of mystery. Ancient philosophers also paid attention to these rivers. Plato and Aristotle considered them symbols of boundaries that the living should not cross. But at the same time, it was the images of Acheron and Styx that were used to explain the very essence of death and retribution in the afterlife. They were not just geographical objects, but part of a worldview in which every person knew that one day he would encounter these waters. The legends of the cults of Acheron and Styx show how closely reality and myth were intertwined. People saw ordinary rivers, but for them, they were doors to another dimension. Where water disappeared underground or flowed too cold to be natural, people felt the breath of the underworld. This mystery remains alive today. Tourists visiting the sources of the Acheron speak of a strange silence and an unusual sense of anxiety. Scientists debate whether the water of the Styx really had poisonous properties, or whether it was the minerals that gave it its lethality. But for the ancients, all this was proof. The line between life and death runs not only in myths, but in nature itself. Acheron and Styx remain symbols of man's ever-searching for ways to communicate with the dead, and his ever-fearfulness of breaking oaths. These rivers were not just part of mythology, they were part of everyday belief, a reminder that behind every stream there may be a gateway to a world where everyone will one day have to go. Mysterious deaths at the Pythian Games. The Pythian Games, held in Delphi every 4 years, were considered one of the most important festivals of ancient Greece. They were dedicated to Apollo and celebrated his victory over the serpent Python, a monster that guarded a sacred spring at the foot of Parnassus. The games included musical competitions, poetry readings, and athletic disciplines similar to the Olympic ones. For the Greeks, they were a symbol of harmony between body and spirit, but along with the solemnity of history, they preserved references to the dark events that took place during the games and remained unsolved. According to ancient chronicles, sudden deaths of participants often occurred in the arena, for which no explanation was found. Young athletes in full health and strength suddenly fell without signs of struggle or injury. Sometimes this happened right during the competition, sometimes at night, in the participants' quarters. The priest interpreted such deaths as a sign of Apollo's wrath, as if the god himself rejected those who defiled the sacred games with hidden sin or broke their oaths. Cases where death was accompanied by strange phenomena were considered especially mysterious. Plutarch wrote about a young man who suddenly went blind during a musical competition and died that same night, and his instrument began to sound by itself, as if an invisible hand had run its strings. Another story tells of a runner who, moments before winning, stopped, as if an invisible force had grabbed him, and collapsed to the ground. Locals and pilgrims who came to Delphi whispered that the spirits that Apollo had once driven out when he killed Python were to blame. It was believed that the earth, soaked in the monster's blood, still held his shadow, and from time to time, it took revenge on those who set foot in the sacred arena. Other observations supported this version. Sometimes during the games, thick fogs descended from Parnassus, and the air smelled of sulfur, as if the earth itself were revealing its dark depths. The priests tried to appease the gods. They made sacrifices, performed special purification rites, and offered prayers. But the people were not always calmed down. It was ingrained in people's memories that the games, intended to glorify harmony, sometimes became the scene of death that could not be explained. This gave each competition an alarming tone. No one could be sure that the next athlete would not become a victim of a mystical force. Modern scientists are trying to find more rational explanations. Some believe that the cause could have been heart disease, hidden from contemporaries, or poisoning from water from springs saturated with sulfurous fumes. Others suggest that mental overload could have been to blame. The participants were under enormous pressure because their performance was considered a gift to Apollo. But none of these explanations remove the aura of mystery, because ancient texts mention too many strange coincidences and mystical details. Archaeologists exploring the ruins of Delphi found traces of underground cracks from which gases were evaporating. These fumes were probably used by the priestess Pythia for prophecies. Perhaps they were the cause of sudden deaths and visions during the games. But for the ancient Greeks, such phenomena were not poisonous gases, but the breath of a god who decided who was allowed to emerge victorious and who should be taken away. The mystery of the mysterious deaths at the Pythian Games remains part of the mystical image of Delphi to this day. For a modern researcher, this is a story about a man's encounter with natural forces that he did not understand. For the ancients, it was proof that the god Apollo was present at the festival and was choosing the outcome of the competitions himself. This is the greatness and darkness of Delphi, a place where prophecy and death, celebration and fear are so closely intertwined that it is impossible to separate one from the other. The curse of the Labdacids. The history of ancient Thebes preserves one of the darkest and most mysterious legends, the curse of the Labdacid family, to which Oedipus and his descendants belonged. This curse became not just a family drama, but a whole symbol of fate, which is impossible to escape, and which is passed down from generation to generation, like a shadow hanging over the entire city. According to myths, the tragedy began with Labdacus, the king of Thebes and grandson of Cadmus, the city's founder. His descendants, including Laius and Oedipus, were caught up in a chain of bloody events. The prophecies and oaths that their ancestors had once broken became eternal punishment. The priests said that the city itself bore the mark of this curse, and anyone who occupied the Theban throne would be caught up in a circle of betrayal, murder, and horror. The story of Oedipus is the central link in this tragic line. His father, Laius, received a prophecy that his son would kill him and marry his own mother. In fear, Laius ordered the baby to be disposed of, but fate decreed otherwise. The child survived and grew up far from Thebes. When Oedipus returned, he unwittingly fulfilled the prophecy. He killed Laius and married Jocasta, not knowing that she was his mother. This terrible turn of events embodied the idea that no man can escape his predetermined destiny. But the curse did not end there. Oedipus's children, Polynices, Eteocles, Antigone, and Ismene, also fell victim to fate. The brothers killed each other in a battle for power. Antigone died for her loyalty to the law of the heart, and Ismene remained a shadow, having lost everything. Each new generation brought new tragedies, and it seemed that the Labdacid line was doomed to eternal suffering. The mystery of the curse is that it was not limited to one family. For the Greeks, it symbolized the very nature of fate. The Thebans believed that a family line could bear the mark of the sins of its ancestors, and no sacrifice or prayer could erase that guilt. Even the gods seemed to be pleased to maintain this chain, as a reminder to men that no one was above the law of fate. Ancient poets and playwrights made this story eternal. Sophocles in his tragedies showed Oedipus and his children as symbols of humanity, which tries to resist fate, but again and again finds itself captive to invisible forces. For theatergoers, this was not just a myth, but a living experience of horror. After all, if even kings and heroes cannot escape the curse, then what is left for a mere mortal? Archaeologists have found inscriptions and cult objects in Thebes that commemorate the Labdacids, Bones of animals sacrificed in an attempt to appease the gods and stop the chain of misfortunes have been found in sacrificial pits. But these rituals do not seem to have brought relief. Legends of the curse continued to live on, and each new ruler of Thebes perceived it as a shadow over his throne. Today, the Labdacid curse remains one of the most powerful images of the ancient world. It is not just a family story, but a universal myth that the past cannot be erased, and fate overtakes everyone who tries to escape it. For the ancient Greeks, it was a reminder that neither strength, nor power, nor wisdom can save from what is already written into the fabric of the world. The mystique of this story is that it rings true even after thousands of years. We sense that the image of the Labdacids conceals a universal truth. A man can build cities, erect temples, and write laws, but he cannot escape his own shadow. And that is why the legend of the curse of the Oedipus family lives on, remaining an eternal symbol of the inevitability of fate. The mystical eagle of Zeus and its disappearance. In ancient mythology, the eagle was considered a sacred bird of Zeus, a symbol of his power, heavenly might and lightning with which he struck enemies. But in addition to poetic images, there were also legends associated with real rituals and strange phenomena, which made the cult of the eagle one of the most mysterious traditions of ancient Greece. The eagle of Zeus is mentioned already in Homeric texts as a messenger of the will of the supreme god. The appearance of the bird in the sky above the battlefield was considered a prophetic sign. If the eagle soared high and freely, it promised victory. If it fell down or disappeared into the fog, it foreshadowed death. The priests at the temples of the Olympian carefully watched the flight of eagles and interpreted it as an indication from the deity himself. But sometimes, something happened that defied explanation. Ancient chronicles have preserved stories about the mysterious disappearance of the sacred eagle in Olympia. It was believed that one of the gods' eagles always lived in this city, where games were held in honor of Zeus. It flew from the mountains and lived near the altar, feeding on sacrificial meat. But one day, as Pausanias writes, the eagle disappeared without a trace. People looked for it in the surrounding area, made special sacrifices, but the bird never returned. This event caused horror. It was perceived as a sign that Zeus was turning away from people. There were other versions. Some claimed that the eagle flew too high and disappeared into the sky, as if it had returned to the god himself. Others said that the priests had kidnapped it, hiding it in underground storage facilities to strengthen their own influence. But in any case, the bird's disappearance became a legend, and its absence a symbol of impending disasters. The eagle cult also had a special significance in the mysteries. In some rites connected with initiation into secret knowledge, a golden image of an eagle was used, which was raised on long poles. When the participants looked at the shining figure in the light of torches, it seemed to them that it was hovering in the air. This image symbolized the ascent of the soul to heaven, but they also said that sometimes, instead of an image, a real bird appeared during the ritual, as if Zeus himself was taking part in the action. The mystery of Zeus's eagle is that it was not only a symbol, but also a real observable phenomenon. People saw birds in the sky and attributed their appearance to the intervention of the god. But the disappearances and strange behavior of these eagles turned into mystical events. For the ancients, this was proof that symbols live and act as real as the gods they represent. Modern researchers suggest that the eagle cult could be connected with more ancient shamanic traditions. In some regions of the Mediterranean, the eagle was considered a guide of souls, capable of carrying them to the afterlife. In Greek religion, this image was transformed into a symbol of Zeus's power, but retained its mystical features. Legends about the disappearance of Zeus's eagle remind us that even the most stable symbols can be fragile. For ancient man, the sudden absence of the sacred bird was not just an accident, but a turning point that made him think about the mercy or wrath of the gods. Today, this myth is perceived as part of the great symbolism of the Greeks. The eagle is not just a bird, but an eternal sign of power that can suddenly disappear, reminding us that no power on earth is eternal. And herein lies the main mystery. The eagle of Zeus remains both a symbol of victory and a harbinger of death, a living image that connects heaven and earth. The mystery of the Colossus of Rhodes, the lost wonder of the world. The Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was erected in honor of the sun god Helios after the victory of the inhabitants of Rhodes over the troops of Demetrius Poliorcetes in the early 3rd century BC. According to descriptions by ancient authors, the statue reached more than 30 meters in height and towered over the city, shining with a bronze sheen. It was meant to symbolize not only the power of Rhodes, but also the patronage of Helios, whose cult was particularly strong here. However, the fate of the Colossus is shrouded in mystery, and its disappearance has given rise to many riddles. Ancient sources report that the statue did not last long. 56 years after its installation, Rhodes was struck by a powerful earthquake. The Colossus collapsed, and its huge fragments scattered across the ground. Plutarch wrote that, even lying on the ground, it made a powerful impression. People walked between the giant fingers of the statue, and each finger was taller than a human. Despite the destruction, the people of Rhodes did not dare to restore the Colossus. The oracle at Delphi warned them, saying that the fall of the statue was a sign of the displeasure of the gods. For centuries, the remains of the Colossus remained in place. Pilgrims and travelers described them with admiration and horror. It seemed that the earth itself could not accommodate such a grandiose creation. But in the 7th century AD, Muslim conquerors, according to legend, took away the bronze remains and resold them. Since then, the trail of the Colossus has been lost. No one knows what happened to the bronze pieces, and the exact place where it stood remains a subject of debate. The biggest mystery is what exactly the Colossus looked like. For centuries, the image of the giant standing over the entrance to the Rhodes harbor, as if ships passed between his legs, was common. However, modern historians consider this picture unlikely. The necessary technologies for such a structure did not exist in antiquity. Most likely, the Colossus rose on a hill facing the sea, or stood at the entrance to the city. But the lack of precise descriptions makes it one of the most controversial mysteries of antiquity. There are also more mystical versions. Some researchers suggest that the Colossus could have been not only a statue, but also a kind of solar beacon. Its bronze surface, reflecting the sun's rays, could have served as a guide for ships. This version is supported by descriptions of the statue's glow, which was visible from afar. For ancient sailors, this could have seemed like a divine sign showing the way. But the mystery of the Colossus was not only its disappearance. There were legends that the fall of the statue brought a curse on the island. Rhodes lost some of its power, and many believed that this was due to the fact that people tried to put themselves on the same level as the gods by erecting such a grandiose image. Modern archaeologists are still looking for traces of the Colossus. Some studies indicate that the debris may not have been removed, but buried under layers of earth and sand. Others believe that the place where it was installed was chosen specifically so that it would disappear along with the fall, dissolving into legend. The Colossus of Rhodes remains an unsolved mystery. We know it existed, but we don't know exactly what it looked like or where it stood. Its fall has become a symbol of the frailty of greatness, and its image is an eternal reminder that even the most grandiose creations of man disappear, leaving only a shadow in memory. And perhaps this is where the mystical power of the Colossus lies. It became a miracle not only as a material object, but also as a mystery that lives through the centuries. Secret signs on the walls of the Parthenon. The Parthenon, erected on the Athenian Acropolis in the 5th century BC, has always been perceived as a symbol of the greatness of ancient Greece, the embodiment of harmony, reason, and the power of the polis. Its snow-white columns, graceful proportions, and exquisite reliefs became the standard for the architecture of the entire subsequent world. But among its stone walls, archaeologists and researchers found something strange: barely noticeable symbols and inscriptions, the origin of which remains a mystery. These signs seem to be hiding in the shadow of the majestic structure, and their meaning still raises questions. A detailed study of the surfaces of the blocks that make up the Parthenon revealed carved lines, crosses, spirals, and geometric shapes. At first glance, they might seem like traces of processing or random marks from workers, but their arrangement is too orderly. In some places, the signs form sequences reminiscent of ancient alphabets or sacred symbols. Some researchers associate them with marks of builders who noted the order of laying stones. But there is another version. These were secret signs left by priests or initiates into the mysteries. They could be used as reference points in rituals or as a kind of cipher, allowing those who knew the secret to read hidden messages in the walls. Particularly enigmatic are the images that resemble star maps. On some blocks, barely noticeable dots and lines are visible that form constellations. When compared with the night sky of Athens, it becomes clear that they reflect the positions of the stars in certain years. For the ancient Greeks, astronomy and religion were closely linked. The movement of the stars was perceived as the language of the gods. Perhaps the Parthenon was not just a temple to Athena, but served as an astronomical sanctuary where the walls kept maps of the sky. There are also symbols similar to those found on lead curse tablets. This may indicate that even in the heart of Athenian democracy and rational philosophy, secret practices of magic were preserved. People left not only prayers, but also spells on the walls of the temple, hoping that the power of the goddess Athena would fulfill their requests or punish their enemies. Modern archaeologists are finding more and more evidence that such signs were common in ancient temples. But it is in the Parthenon that they acquire a special power. The majestic temple, a symbol of light and knowledge, holds within itself the shadows of secrets. This duality enhances the mystical aura of the structure. There is also a hypothesis that some of the signs were not applied in antiquity, but later, at a time when the Parthenon was used as a Christian church or even as a mosque. At that time, the symbols could have been associated with other rituals, but those signs that are carved deep into the stone and are barely noticeable under the layers of time, in all likelihood, belong to ancient masters. The mystery is that we will never be able to say for sure why they were there. Were they construction marks or a secret language addressed to the gods? Perhaps for the Athenians, the Parthenon was not only a temple, but also a sacred text written in stone, and only a few could read it to the end. Today, tourists see only majestic columns and ruins of ancient grandeur in the Parthenon, but those who look closely notice tiny marks on its stones, traces of secret practices, lost knowledge, and the mystical side of Athens. They remind us that even in the heart of the mind, there is always a shadow of mystery, ghost warriors of Salamis. The naval battle of Salamis in 480 BC was a turning point in the Greco-Persian Wars. Athens and its allies were able to stop Xerxes' huge fleet, and the Greeks saw this victory as proof of the god's patronage. But along with the military glory came dark legends about how the sea around the island held not only memories, but also the souls of the fallen. Ancient authors mentioned that years after the battle, fishermen and sailors often reported strange phenomena in the waters of Salamis. At night, shadows of ships appeared among the waves, as if the bronze triremes were going into battle again. Sometimes, in the fog, you could make out the silhouettes of warriors in armor. Their cries and the blows of the oars sounded so clear that it seemed the battle was still going on. Those who saw this described a feeling of icy horror. The sea became alien, and even experienced sailors refused to set sail on such nights. There were also more sinister accounts. Some fishermen claimed to have seen the figures of drowned warriors rise from the water, covered in seaweed and shells, with empty eyes filled with darkness. These ghosts moved silently across the surface of the sea and dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the smell of salt and rot. People believed that these were the souls of those who had not been properly buried and remained forever chained to the place of their death. The Athenians believed that the ghosts of Salamis appeared as a harbinger of wars and disasters. Before the Peloponnesian War, many claimed to have heard the strokes of oars and the cries of warriors in the night waters again. For some, this was a sign of the wrath of the gods. For others, a reminder of glory that must be preserved at any cost. The priests tried to appease the spirits of the sea. They made sacrifices on the shore. They brought wine and bread as gifts, sometimes animals, throwing them into the sea. But the stories about ghosts did not stop. Even centuries later, travelers mentioned that the Gulf of Salamis retained a strange atmosphere of anxiety and silence, as if the water itself remembered the blood spilled in those days. Modern researchers believe that the legends may have arisen due to special natural conditions. Fogs, moon reflections, and echoes in rocky bays really do create the impression of the presence of an invisible fleet. But the power of these stories lies in the fact that they were not just tricks of nature. For the Greeks, this was confirmation. The spirits of the warriors did not leave. They remained to guard their homeland and remind their descendants of the price of victory. The mystery of the phantom warriors of Salamis is that they became part of cultural memory. People came to this place not only as a battlefield, but also as a sanctuary where the living could meet the shadows of heroes. And even if the phenomena were a figment of the imagination, they formed a sense that history had not ended, that the battle was continuing in another reality. Today, Salamis is an island with modern settlements and quiet bays. But for those who know the legends, its waters remain filled with mystery. One only has to look out to sea on a moonless night, and it seems that the ghostly fleet is once again lining up behind the horizon, ready for battle. The death of Helion is a legend about the god of the sun. In the myths of ancient Greece, Helios occupies a special place. Unlike Apollo, who later became associated with sunlight and music, Helios was the original god of the sun, the one who rode across the sky daily in a fiery chariot drawn by 4 shining horses. He was considered all-seeing. Nothing on earth could escape Helios's gaze. But it is precisely in this image, seemingly eternal and unshakable, that the mystery is hidden. There were legends about his death, disappearance, or loss of power, and these stories reflect the mystical side of Greek religion, in which even the gods could collide with fate. The most famous myth about the death of Helios is connected with his son Phaethon. According to legend, the young man wanted to prove his divine origin and asked his father to let him drive the solar chariot himself. Helios, bound by an oath, could not refuse. But Phaethon could not cope with the fiery horses. The chariot got out of control, either soaring too high and threatening to burn the heavens, or falling too low and scorching the earth. Zeus, in order to save the world, struck Phaethon with lightning. The chariot collapsed, and the young man's body fell into the Eridanus River. This myth is often interpreted as a warning about the limits of human pride. But there is another nuance to it. It was at the very moment when Helios' son died that the sun god himself showed his weakness. He was unable to protect his own child and his creation. There were other versions. In some regions of Hellas, it was said that Helios once disappeared when his chariot fell into the depths of the ocean. The earth was plunged into darkness, people lost the sense of time, and only after sacrifices and prayers did he return. These stories echo the dying and rising god motif found in many ancient cultures. For the Greeks, this may have been an explanation for solar eclipses or unusually dark days, which were seen as a sign that the god of light was dying and being reborn. In some hymns, Helios is described not as an eternal ruler, but as a being threatened by old age. The sun, said one of the Orphic poets, carves its way across the sky until its chariot is exhausted. This image creates the feeling that even the heavenly body is subject to time, and one day its power will fade. For ancient man, this was an alarming reminder. Nothing in the world lasts forever, not even the sun, without which life is impossible. The cults dedicated to Helios on the island of Rhodes add a special mystery. Rhodes was the main center of his worship. Here stood the Colossus of Rhodes, a giant statue of the god of the sun, one of the 7 wonders of the world. But here too the story is shrouded in mysticism. The statue collapsed as a result of an earthquake, and the inhabitants, on the advice of the oracle, did not restore it. Many saw in this a symbol of the death of Helios himself, as if the deity lost his power along with the fall of his statue. Philosophers also touched on the topic of Helios's mortality. Plato in his laws mentioned that even the gods could be part of the cosmic cycle, and if the sun were to go out, it would be part of a predetermined order. The Stoics saw Helios not so much as a person, but as a fiery logos, the breath of the world. But even they spoke of the end of time, when the sun would swallow up all that exists and disappear itself. Modern researchers suggest that the myths about the death of Helios reflect real natural phenomena. For example, unusual eclipses, volcanic eruptions, or dust storms, when the sky became dark for many days. For ancient people, this could have seemed like the death of the sun. One version connects these myths with the eruption of the Santorini volcano, which occurred in the Bronze Age and caused a long darkness in the region. But for the Greeks, these stories were more than just explanations of nature. They saw in them a mystical lesson. If even the sun god could disappear, then the world was such that everything great was subject to fall. This idea fueled the philosophy of the tragic worldview that later manifested itself in the dramas of Sophocles and Euripides. The mystery of Helios's death is that it combines myth, cosmology, and man's fear of the incomprehensible. We see in it a reflection of the eternal question: what happens if the light disappears, and who can bring it back? For the ancient Greeks, the answer was clear. Only through sacrifice, through an appeal to the gods, could the sun be revived. For us, it is a reminder of the fragility of the world in which we live. And perhaps that is why the legend of Helios still excites the imagination. It reminds us that light is not only a physical phenomenon, but also a symbol of hope, knowledge, life. And if even this light can fade, then every victory and every civilization will one day turn into a shadow. The mystical cult of Nycta, the goddess of night. Of all the deities in the ancient Greek pantheon, Nyx, the goddess of night, remained one of the most mysterious and disturbing figures. Unlike the Olympian gods, whose temples and sacrifices were well known, Nyx's cult was almost always hidden in the shadows. She was not depicted on coins, and no majestic temples were built to her in the main squares of cities. But she was present in the consciousness of the Hellenes as an ancient force, born of the most primordial darkness, the mother of many chthonic deities, among whom were Thanatos, death, Hypnos, sleep, the Erinyes, goddesses of vengeance, and even the Moirai, mistresses of fate. This lineage showed that Nyx occupied a special place. She embodied the very basis of the universe, the shadow that preceded the light. In Hesiod's myths, Nyx was said to have existed before Zeus and all the Olympians. She lived in a dark realm beyond the light, and her shadow fell upon the world every evening when the sun went down. To the ancient Greeks, Nyx was not only a natural phenomenon, but also a being whose breath brought dreams and sometimes nightmares. Her darkness hid secrets and opened the gates to another world where spirits lived and where the souls of the dead wandered. The cult of Nyx was closely connected with secret rites and mysteries. In the Orphic hymns, the goddess was called sacred and blessed, mother of gods and men, but also terrible and implacable. Sacrifices were made to her not during the day, but at night, most often black animals, symbolizing her connection with darkness. The priests performed rites by torchlight, reciting spells and hymns, asking the goddess to grant revelation through dreams or protection from demons that came in the darkness. The cult of Nycta occupied a special place in Thebes and Orchomenus, where, according to ancient authors, there were small sanctuaries dedicated to this goddess. There, rituals of fortune-telling and dreams were performed. People who wanted to know their fate would stay overnight in the sanctuary, and it was believed that Nyx could appear to them in visions, either herself or through messengers, dreams filled with symbols. This echoed the practice of the sleep temples, but unlike Asclepius, Nyx did not promise healing. She revealed secret paths that could be as frightening as they were enlightening. Fears of nightmares were also associated with Nycta. It was believed that if the goddess was benevolent, dreams would be bright and would bring revelation. But if a person broke her law or was unclean in soul, Nycta sent horrors that could drive one to madness. Therefore, her cult had a dual nature. She could be both a protector and an avenger. Some philosophers, such as Empedocles and Plato, viewed Nyx as an allegory, an embodiment of the chaos and nothingness that preceded the cosmos. But to ordinary Greeks, she was a very real being. Her darkness was palpable. Every evening, when the sun disappeared behind the horizon, her power began. So many tried to appease her with small sacrifices in the home, drops of wine, bread, sometimes clay figures that were left at the door, so that the darkness would pass by and not bring troubles. It remains a mystery that the cult of Nyx was almost never official, but traces of her worship are found everywhere. Archaeologists find amulets and burials with images of the moon and stars, which could be associated with her power. Hymns have been preserved in Orphic texts where she is asked to open the gates of sleep and show the truth. These texts indicate that the goddess was worshipped by those who sought secret knowledge related to fate and death. What adds to the mystique is that Nyx was perceived as the mother of the fates, those who determine the fate of each person. If even Zeus could not change the decisions of the fates, then their mother had even greater power. This idea made the cult of Nyx especially frightening. She could be older and more powerful than Olympus itself. Modern scholars suggest that the worship of Nyx goes back to pre-Olympic times, when people worshipped the forces of nature directly, without dividing them into gods and spirits. Darkness was then as powerful as the sun or the sea, and although her cult was later supplanted by brighter images, it continued to exist on the periphery of Greek religion, in secret rites, mysteries, and fears of the night. The mystery of Nyx is that she embodies the very essence of the unknown. Her cult left no grand temples or statues, but her name and her presence permeated the lives of every Greek. Every evening, when night fell, people knew Nyx was once again embracing the world, and no one could escape her power. Her cult reminds us that the ancient Greeks saw in the world not only light and order, but also darkness, chaos, an incomprehensible principle that had to be reckoned with. And this is why the myth of the goddess of night continues to excite the imagination. It shows that even in the greatest civilization of antiquity, there was a recognition that darkness always stands alongside light. The mystery of the destruction of the Mycenaean palace. Mycenae, the ancient center of one of the most powerful civilizations of the Bronze Age, holds a secret that has not yet been solved. The city, celebrated in the Iliad as gold-rich Mycenae, was the heart of Achaean culture, the place where the legendary kings Agamemnon and his ancestors ruled. The palace, which stood on the Acropolis and was surrounded by powerful Cyclopean walls, was not just the residence of the ruler, but a symbol of power, wealth, and connection with the gods. But around the 12th century BC, this center collapsed. Its halls were empty, its walls were blackened by fires, and the fate of its inhabitants was shrouded in fog. What happened to the Mycenaean palace? A sudden invasion? A divine curse? Or an internal catastrophe? Archaeological excavations show that the destruction was sudden and catastrophic. Traces of a massive fire have been found in many areas of the palace: charred beams, melted pottery, blackened walls. But what caused the fire? Some researchers believe it was an attack from outside, perhaps by the so-called Sea Peoples, whose arrival in the eastern Mediterranean coincides with the fall of Mycenae. These mysterious nomads destroyed many cities, and it is likely that Mycenae fell victim to them. However, there is another version. Some archaeologists point out that the palace walls do not bear traces of a long siege. At the same time, vessels and objects are found in the layers of destruction, which indicate the suddenness of the catastrophe. People did not have time to take out valuables. Many died right in the halls. This gave reason to assume that the palace burned down as a result of an internal uprising, or even ritual arson. Perhaps the residents themselves rose up against the rulers, tired of taxes and endless wars. In popular memory, the destruction of the palace was entrenched in myths. The story of the curse of the Atrae, Agamemnon's ancestors, could have been a reflection of a real catastrophe. According to the myth, the Atreid family was doomed to bloody murders and betrayals. And if the palace became the seat of their power, then its destruction was perceived as the fulfillment of a divine curse. For the Greeks, the fall of Mycenae was not just a historical event, but a mystical sign that no force could withstand the wrath of the gods. Adding to the mystery, the destruction of the Mycenaean palace coincided with the Bronze Age catastrophe, a massive crisis that engulfed the entire eastern Mediterranean. Within a few decades, powerful kingdoms had collapsed, trade routes had ceased to exist, and writing systems had disappeared. The destruction of Mycenae was part of this great catastrophe, but it took on a special meaning here, in the land of legends. Some scholars have suggested that natural disasters may have been the cause. Earthquakes, which were common in Greece, could have damaged the palace and caused a fire. There is also evidence of possible droughts and famines, which could have led to social unrest. When you combine all these factors, invasions, disasters, and internal conflicts, it becomes clear that the fall of Mycenae was not a single event, but the result of many blows. But for the Greeks themselves, the answer was clear. The palace had fallen because its inhabitants had offended the gods. Perhaps it was because of the death of Iphigenia, sacrificed by Agamemnon for the sake of the campaign against Troy. Perhaps it was because of the bloody crimes within the Atreid dynasty. Whatever the explanation, the myths preserved the memory that Mycenae's glory was marred by horror. Today, tourists climbing the Lion Gate see the ruins of the palace, its massive walls and burnt foundations. It is hard to believe that once upon a time the songs of the Aedes were heard here. Gold shone, and rulers held feasts. But every stone bears traces of a sudden catastrophe. The mystery of the destruction of the Mycenaean palace remains alive because it combines myth and history. On the one hand, we have archaeological evidence: fire, destruction, traces of violence. On the other hand, there are the myths about the curse of the Atreids, which make the destruction of the palace not an accident, but a predestination. Perhaps this is where the mystical power of Mycenae lies. They remind us that even the most powerful cities can disappear overnight, leaving behind only shadows and legends. And while archaeologists continue excavations and historians argue about the causes of the disaster, the palace remains a silent witness to the tragedy. Its walls no longer tower over Hellas, but its silence sounds louder than any words, as a reminder that greatness always contains the seed of its own destruction. Prophecies about the death of Alexander the Great. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC was one of the most mysterious events of antiquity. The man who had conquered almost the entire known world died suddenly in Babylon at the age of 32, and the reasons for this are still controversial. But even more questions are raised by the numerous prophecies and omens that, according to ancient authors, foreshadowed his death. These stories turned the death of the great conqueror not only into a historical fact, but also into a mystical plot in which signs of fate, divine warnings, and secret forces are intertwined. One of the most famous omens was the story of the temple in Babylon. A few days before Alexander's death, the temple of the god Belos was struck by lightning. This was perceived as a terrible sign. The thunderer Zeus himself, Alexander's patron, had apparently turned away from him. The priests tried to appease the gods with sacrifices, but the anxiety did not go away. Another ominous omen was the story of the lions. According to Plutarch, the king's lions, kept in cages at the palace, were suddenly torn to pieces by donkeys. This strange and humiliating incident was interpreted as a symbol of the fall of the great and exalted at the hands of the weak and insignificant. For the people of that time, this was not an accident, but a sign of the end of the king. There were also dreams that troubled Alexander and those around him. Once he dreamed of a young man with a torch who led him into the underworld and pointed to a gate beyond which darkness reigned. In another dream, he saw a huge black bird circling above his throne and covering it with a shadow. These dreams were considered not just figments of the imagination, but direct signs of fate. A special place in the legends is occupied by the story of the priests of the Sibyl, who supposedly predicted to Alexander that he would die in Babylon. To avoid this, the king avoided the capital of Mesopotamia, but in the end, he still ended up there, by the will of circumstances and fate. This story reflects the Greek idea of inevitability. Even if you know your prophecy, it is impossible to avoid it. Ancient texts also mention that before his death, Alexander felt unusually weak, but continued to organize feasts and sacrifices. His sudden illness was accompanied by a high fever and loss of voice. Servants claimed that during his last days they saw strange lights above the palace, and sounds like screams were heard in the night. For a modern person, this could be a manifestation of illness and hallucinations. But for the ancient Greeks and Babylonians, these were signs that the king was entering the other world. The causes of death remain a matter of debate. Some say it was malaria or typhoid fever. Others say it was poisoning. But the mystery lies not only in the disease itself. What is important is that Alexander's death was perceived by his contemporaries not as an accident, but as the fulfillment of a prophecy. His life, full of victories and miraculous events, could not have ended otherwise than surrounded by mystical omens. There is also a theory that Alexander's death was part of a conspiracy, and that the stories of prophecies were added later to give it an aura of fate. But if so, then the legends were stronger than the facts. For many generations of Greeks and Romans, Alexander became a symbol of a man whose fate was predetermined from above, and even the greatest of kings cannot escape his predetermined end. The mystery of these prophecies is that they create a sense of dramatic predetermination. Each sign, lightning, a dream, the strange behavior of animals, adds up to a picture in which Alexander's death seems not accidental, but inevitable. This picture corresponds to the very spirit of Greek culture, where fate was always stronger than human will. Today, Alexander's death remains a mystery to historians and doctors, but the myths of prophecy make it even more compelling. They turn history into a drama in which the man who conquered the world found himself powerless before fate, and perhaps this is what makes his figure eternal. Alexander remains not only a conqueror, but also a symbol of the fact that even the greatest heroes are subject to a mystery that cannot be solved. Sinister sacrifices in Sparta. Sparta always stood out among other Greek cities for its severity, military discipline, and asceticism. The education of citizens here was based on constant readiness for war, and state orders were imbued with military necessity. But along with this practicality, there was another side, a cult, mystical one, where sacrifices became the main means of communication with the gods. And if in Athens or Delphi the emphasis was on solemn rites, then in Sparta the sacrifices often had a gloomy and even sinister character, causing horror among neighbors and admiration among the Spartans themselves. One of the most mysterious rites was the sacrifice at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. Every year, Spartan youths were brought to the temple, where they had to undergo trials, They were scourged until they bled in front of the statue of the goddess. It was believed that the suffering of the youths appeased Artemis and confirmed their readiness for life in a harsh society. For spectators, it looked like a bloody sacrifice, and many died during the ritual. Archaeologists actually find traces of human blood in the layers of the sanctuary, which confirms that the rite was not only symbolic. No less gloomy was the cult of punitive sacrifices. The Spartans believed that in the event of military failures or epidemics, special sacrifices had to be made, sometimes even human ones. Ancient authors mention that before important battles, priests could sacrifice prisoners of war, especially if it was necessary to appease Ares or Zeus. These sacrifices were made at night, on the outskirts of the city, or before a campaign, and were perceived as a necessary payment for victory. A special place was occupied by sacrifices connected with the cult of heroes. In Sparta, the heroes of the past were worshipped, especially Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver. Animal sacrifices and wine were offered at his tomb, but some sources speak of human sacrifices. These rites were meant to strengthen the bond between the Spartans and their founders, and to confirm that Sparta's laws and martial spirit came from a supernatural force. The cruel rituals also had a practical meaning. For the Spartans, suffering was considered proof of fortitude. Unlike other Greeks who often sacrificed animals and limited themselves to symbolic actions, the Spartans saw blood and pain as a direct path to appeasing the gods. Their cult life was a continuation of the military. If on the battlefield one must die for the state, then one must shed blood before the gods to save it. These rituals horrified their contemporaries. The Athenians and other cities considered them barbaric, but for the Spartans themselves, they were a sacred part of life. In their understanding, only through blood and sacrifice could one achieve unity with the gods and guarantee victory in wars. That is why even boys from an early age were accustomed to pain and blood. They were taught to perceive suffering as a natural part of existence. The mystery of Spartan sacrifices is that they combined the religious and the social. They were not only rituals, but also trials that shaped the character of citizens. They nurtured that very Spartan spirit that made this polis a legend. But at the same time, sacrifices remained a mystical act in which people believed that they directly communicated with the gods through suffering and death. Archaeologists studying Spartan sanctuaries continue to find evidence of these practices: animal and human bones, traces of blood, weapons used in rituals. All this confirms that Sparta lived in constant connection with the world of death and war. Today, Sparta's gruesome sacrifices are a reminder that even the greatest civilizations of antiquity had rituals that balanced between faith and cruelty. For the Spartans, this was normal, part of their culture, but for us it remains a mystery. How could one combine the greatness of discipline and wisdom with such bloody rituals? Perhaps it is precisely in this paradox that Sparta's strength lies. It built its greatness on a willingness to face pain, and its gods demanded the same. The mystery of the cult of Pan and the disappearing shepherds. Among the many deities of the ancient Greek pantheon, Pan stood out for his special duality. On the one hand, he was the patron of forests, flocks, and shepherds, played the flute, and gave fertility to the land. On the other hand, his image was inextricably linked with fear, sudden madness, and disappearances that had troubled the inhabitants of mountain villages for centuries. The cult of Pan was closely connected with nature, and this was where his mystical and sinister power lay. Pan was depicted with goat horns, a beard, and hooves, forever wandering the mountains and ravines of Arcadia. In myths, he could appear unexpectedly, frightening travelers or even entire armies. This is where the word panic comes from, a sudden, inexplicable horror that was attributed to his intervention. But the legend spoke not only of fear. In places where Pan was worshipped, people would disappear, most often shepherds who tended their flocks alone. Ancient chronicles have preserved references to Pan's sanctuaries in Arcadia, located in caves and gorges. Priests and locals brought him sacrifices of milk, honey, and animals, but they also said that sometimes more sinister gifts were required. According to one version, if a shepherd disappeared without a trace in the mountains, it was considered a sign that Pan had taken him. Such disappearances were perceived not as an accident, but as a sacred sacrifice to the god. There are legends that at night, the sounds of flutes and drums could be heard from the caves dedicated to Pan. Sometimes peasants claimed to have seen dancing shadows in the moonlight, although there were no people nearby. These phenomena were perceived as panic mysteries, in which spirits, nymphs, and the goat-legged god himself participated, and whoever happened to be nearby risked disappearing without a trace, becoming a participant in the eternal dance in honor of Pan. Some philosophers tried to explain the cult of Pan. For Plutarch, he was a symbol of nature, wild and unruly. The disappearance of the shepherds was interpreted as a reflection of man's weakness in the face of the elements. But for the common people, these explanations changed nothing. If a man did not return home from the pasture, it was considered a sacrifice that the god demanded to maintain balance. Archaeologists have indeed found sacrificial pits in Arcadia caves containing animal bones and traces of fire. But there are stranger finds, human bones left with ritual objects. Scientists debate whether these were real sacrifices or accidental burials. But the legends of the lost shepherds make one wonder whether Pan could have demanded much more than milk and honey. Of particular interest is the story of Pausanias, an ancient traveler. He wrote that the inhabitants of Arcadia believed that Pan sometimes kidnapped people to make them his companions. They became something between people and spirits and never returned to the mortal world. In the popular memory, such stories were fixed as a reminder that communication with the gods is always dangerous, and any meeting with them can end in disappearance. Interestingly, the cult of Pan survived longer than many other ancient cults. Even during the Roman Empire, he continued to be worshipped, especially in rural areas. His image was so powerful that later, Pan's features formed the basis of demonic images in the Christian tradition. Perhaps precisely because he embodied fear of the unknown, of darkness, of what lurks in the forests and mountains. The mystery of the cult of Pan is that it combines light and dark. On the one hand, he is the god of joy, music, and fertility. On the other, he is the lord of panic and disappearances. For the ancient Greeks, this duality was natural. Nature could feed, but it could also kill. And Pan was its face, its breath, its secret. Today, the ruins of his sanctuaries and the caves of Arcadia continue to excite the imagination. Those who have been there at night tell of strange sounds and a sense of presence. Perhaps it is just the wind in the mountains, or perhaps it is that same Pan, whose pipe has been playing for thousands of years, reminding us that the world is full of mysteries, and some of them are best left unsolved. Ghosts of the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. The Theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Athenian Acropolis is one of the most sacred places of ancient Hellas. It was here that European drama was born. It was here that the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were first performed. Thousands of spectators gathered for performances that were not just entertainment, but part of a religious cult in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and mystical madness. But behind the glory of the theater, there is a dark side. Already in ancient times, it was said that under its stone benches and in the shadow of the orchestra, there were hidden forces that did not let go of the souls of the dead. Legends about the ghosts of the theater have been preserved in legends and have reached our days, turning this place into one of the most mysterious monuments of Greece. According to myths, Dionysus himself was present at the performances. His invisible image sat next to the Athenians, and it was to him that the first songs of the choir were dedicated. But Dionysus is a dual god. He gave joy and inspiration, but at the same time brought madness and death. It was believed that his presence in the theater could awaken not only rapture, but also the shades of those who had been sacrificed in his honor. In early times, the cult of Dionysus included bloody rites, and although they later became symbolic, their memory lived on in the stones of the sanctuary. Ancient authors mention strange occurrences. Sometimes during performances, actors would suddenly fall dead for no apparent reason. There were cases when spectators would become hysterical, as if they were possessed by a force beyond reason. Contemporaries considered this a manifestation of Dionysus himself, who through the theater granted not only inspiration, but also madness. But there were even more terrifying stories. At night, the sounds of a choir were heard in the theater. Although the stage was empty, and in the darkness between the rows, silhouettes of people in masks allegedly appeared. Archaeologists excavating the area around the theater found objects not directly related to drama. Among them were vessels with remains of wine and blood, bone figurines, and stone tablets with curses. All this indicates that the theater was not only a place of art, but also an arena for secret rites. Perhaps the performances themselves were a form of ritual, in which spectators and actors participated in a mystery that united the world of the living and the dead. The story surrounding the tragedy Oresteia has attracted particular attention from researchers. It was said that during one of its first performances, many spectators left the theater in panic because they felt as if the Erinyes themselves, the goddesses of vengeance, were present on stage with the actors. Their cries and footsteps could be heard even after the performance had ended. For the Athenians, this was proof that the theater could evoke not only catharsis, but also a real presence of the otherworldly. Among the legends about the theater of Dionysus, there are stories about cursed actors. According to legend, some of them, who played the roles of heroes doomed to death, actually died shortly after the performance. This was explained by the fact that the actor entered too deeply into the character, and the spirit of the character took him with it. These stories created an atmosphere of fear around the stage. Every actor knew that playing in the theater of Dionysus was not just art, but a dangerous ritual in which one could lose his life. There is also evidence that at night, the figures of priests and participants in the mysteries appeared in the theater. They did not play roles, but performed secret rituals, calling upon Dionysus and his companions, satyrs and maenads. The sounds of flutes and drums heard at night frightened the inhabitants of Athens. Those who happened to be nearby claimed to have seen the shadows of dancing women with torches and heard laughter that suddenly stopped, leaving behind a dead silence. Philosophers have explained this phenomenon in different ways. Plato saw the theater as dangerous, believing that it could destroy reason and lead to madness. For Aristotle, on the contrary, tragedy purified the soul, but even he recognized that the theater carried a mystical power that went beyond art. For ordinary people, the theater of Dionysus remained a place where the line between the human and the divine disappeared, and with it, the ghosts of the past arose. Modern researchers find rational explanations for the legends. The echo and acoustics of the theater could really create the illusion of the presence of invisible voices. The psychological effect of the collective experience of the drama intensified the impression to the point of hallucinations. But even today, many admit, the theater of Dionysus has a special atmosphere. Even empty, it seems to store the energy of thousands of voices that sounded in its stones. The mystique of the theater is also evident in the fact that it has been preserved better than many other monuments. The benches and stage seem to have stubbornly survived the centuries, although wars and earthquakes have destroyed much around them. For some, this is proof that Dionysus himself guards his sanctuary. His ghosts remain here not to frighten, but to remind. The theater is not entertainment, but a sacred act. The mystery of the ghosts of the theater of Dionysus is that they reflect the very essence of the cult of this god. Dionysus was associated with trance, the fusion of opposites, the transition from life to death and back. The theater dedicated to him became a place where these transitions became tangible. The spectator, coming to the performance, became a participant in the ritual, and even after thousands of years, the shadows continue to remind us that art and mysticism are inseparable. Today, tourists sitting on the stone benches of the theater can feel a special silence, as if the voices of tragedies, the whispers of choirs, and the steps of long-gone actors still resound here. The theater of Dionysus remains not just an architectural monument, but a portal to another world. A world where art, religion, and mystical experience merged. And perhaps that is why its ghosts live on to this day, making this place eternal. The mystery of the Erinyes, the insatiable goddesses of vengeance. In the mythological consciousness of the ancient Greeks, the Erinyes occupied a special, frightening place. They were called implacable, dark, avengers, and these names were almost always pronounced in a whisper. Unlike the Olympian gods, whose images could be seen on coins and in temples, the Erinyes remained creatures of the shadows, whose presence was felt rather than depicted. They were the product of innocent bloodshed, and their power was considered so great that even Zeus could not stop them completely. The Erinyes reflected the deepest fear of the Greeks, the fear of inevitable retribution for crimes committed against family and nature. According to myths, the Erinyes were born from the blood of the Titan Uranus, spilled by Cronus when he castrated his father. They were connected to the earth itself, to the primordial element that absorbs blood and turns it into an indestructible force. Their task was to pursue those who spilled the blood of their relatives or violated sacred laws. In the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, they appear as shadows from which it is impossible to hide. Wherever the guilty person is, the Erinyes follow him, driving him to madness and death. The most famous example is the story of Orestes. He killed his mother Clytemnestra to avenge the death of his father, Agamemnon. From the point of view of justice, he did the right thing. Clytemnestra really did kill her husband. But for the Erinyes, this act was a crime. The son raised his hand against his mother, violating sacred bonds. From that moment, Orestes was doomed. The Erinyes followed him everywhere, giving him neither sleep nor rest. His persecution became a symbol of the inevitability of retribution. The rites associated with the Erinyes were as dark as the goddesses themselves. In Athens, there was a temple dedicated to them, but it was not located in the city center, but on the outskirts, in a place considered unclean. Sacrifices were made there, black animals, especially dogs. Sometimes blood was used as a gift, and the priests sprinkled it on the ground to appease the goddesses. However, it was considered almost impossible to appease the Erinyes. They could only retreat when the guilt was completely atoned for, or when the Olympians themselves intervened. Ancient philosophers saw the Erinyes as a reflection of the eternal law of nature. For Plato, they symbolized conscience, the inner voice that haunts a person until he or she is cleansed. For the Stoics, they were the embodiment of inevitability. Every action has consequences, and no one can escape retribution. But for ordinary people, the Erinyes remained frightening spirits that could only be feared and revered. The mystery of the Erinyes also lay in their dual role. On the one hand, they were monsters with wings, snake hair, and burning eyes. On the other, they were revered as guardians of justice, albeit cruel. In Aeschylus's tragedy, the Eumenides, they are transformed from avengers into defenders of law and order. Athena persuades them to accept a new cult and become patronesses of the court. This transition shows that the Greeks were trying to reconcile the primitive fear of blood feud with a more rational system of law. Modern scholars believe that the cult of the Erinyes may have originated in pre-Olympic times when people worshipped chthonic deities associated with the earth and death. Perhaps the Erinyes were the personification of the sense of guilt that the community placed on the murderer. The persecution by spirits may have been a form of social pressure. Society would not give the criminal peace until he was punished. But even if this is so, for the Greeks themselves, the Erinyes were real beings, and their presence was felt as strongly as the breath of the wind or the sound of the sea. Legends of the Erinyes' appearance were accompanied by frightening signs. They were said to appear as shadows at night, gathering in the corners of murderers' houses. Sometimes they could be seen in dreams. Women with faces distorted by anger, with snakes instead of hair and whips in their hands. Waking up, a person felt broken, as if part of his soul had already been dragged into the underworld. Archaeological finds also add to the mystery. In some Greek sanctuaries, small figurines of women with wings and snake ornaments have been found, which were probably associated with the cult of the Erinyes. Lead tablets with curses have also been found, where these goddesses were called upon to punish enemies. All this suggests that their cult was a real practice, and not just a myth. Interestingly, the Erinyes did not disappear with the advent of Christianity. In popular beliefs, they were transformed into images of demons and evil spirits, but their essence remained the same. They continued to personify the inevitability of retribution. Even today in Greece, there are legends about shadow women who appear at the sites of bloody crimes. The mystery of the Erinyes lies in their eternity. They were not just part of mythology, but the embodiment of the very law of the world. Everything has a price, and blood calls to blood. This is their mysticism. They do not obey the gods, they obey the very essence of existence. That is why their image still disturbs the imagination. We can forget the names of the gods of Olympus, but the fear of the Erinyes remains in our culture. These goddesses show that the ancient Greeks understood that behind every crime there is not only a human judgment, but also a cosmic judgment. The Erinyes were its face, terrible and inevitable, and that is why they became some of the most mysterious creatures of the ancient world, shadows that continue to haunt humanity even after thousands of years. Mysterious signs on Greek coins. The coins of ancient Greece have long been a symbol of its cultural and economic prosperity. Their elegance and artistic precision amaze even modern researchers. They were minted with profiles of gods, heroes, and rulers, images of animals and sacred symbols, scenes from myths. But among the thousands of known examples, there are coins with mysterious signs whose meaning remains unsolved. These signs, seemingly minor details, turn ordinary trade items into mysterious artifacts in which secret messages are encrypted. An ordinary Greek coin was not just a means of exchange. It was a kind of calling card of the city polis. Athens minted an owl, a symbol of wisdom and the goddess Athena. Corinth was famous for its images of Pegasus, Rhodes, solar discs, and rose flowers. All this had a clear meaning, but there are a series of coins where strange symbols are added to the traditional images. Small dots, stars, lightning, and sometimes unknown signs resembling letters of a non-existent alphabet. Some of the most mysterious coins were found in Ephesus. In addition to the usual images of Artemis, they contain strange signs in the form of intertwined lines, similar to runes. Scientists argue whether these were marks of masters or secret symbols of a cult. Some suggest that these could have been signs dedicated to specific rituals in honor of the goddess, which only the initiates understood. In Athens, there were also coins with unusual details. Some depict owls with inverted heads or with 3 eyes. These strange variations are explained in different ways. Some believe that these are simply minting errors. But supporters of the mystical version claim that such coins were used in secret rituals associated with predictions. The 3-eyed owl could symbolize the goddess's all-seeing and serve as an amulet for the owner. No less interesting are the coins from the island of Delos. There were specimens found there with small dots arranged in the form of constellations. Astronomers who studied these patterns noticed that they coincided with the map of the sky in certain years. Perhaps the coins served as a kind of calendar or a reminder of the mysteries held on the island. If this is true, then they were not just money, but keys to understanding the secrets of the sky. There are even darker versions. Some researchers believe that the mysterious signs on the coins could be associated with curses and magic spells. In antiquity, there was a practice of applying secret symbols to objects to attract or repel power. A coin that had passed through many hands became the ideal carrier of such a message. This hypothesis is supported by the finds of coins in graves. They were not simply placed in the mouth of the deceased to pay Charon, but were also accompanied by incomprehensible symbols, as if they were supposed to protect the soul in the afterlife. Archaeologists have also found coins with letters that do not belong to the Greek, Phoenician, or any other known alphabet. These symbols remain undeciphered. They may have been the personal signs of the masters, but something else is also possible. Secret marks, understandable only to a narrow circle of initiates. It is curious that the Greeks themselves were suspicious of coins. There are hints in literature that certain signs could bring good luck, or, conversely, misfortune. In everyday life, such coins could be kept as amulets. They were not spent, but left in the house, believing that they would attract wealth or protect from trouble. Philosophers also did not leave this topic unattended. Plutarch wrote that the images and symbols on coins form the memory of gods and myths, but he noted that some of these images are incomprehensible and can contain a deeper meaning. In this, we can see a hint that even in his time there was an understanding. Not all coins carry an obvious meaning. Some of them are encrypted. Modern cryptographers and archaeologists have tried to create databases of mysterious signs on Greek coins, but there are too many of them and too few repetitions to form a unified system. This makes each such find unique. Perhaps this was the idea. Each coin with a secret sign was an individual amulet or code, understandable only to the initiated. The mystery of Greek coins shows that even the most practical objects could carry a mystical load. In the hands of ancient man, a coin was not just a means of payment, but a magical symbol. It passed through hundreds of hands, passed from city to city, and with it traveled secret signs, the meaning of which we still do not know. And perhaps this is where its mystical power lies. A coin intended for exchange turned into a bearer of secrets that could not be exchanged or fully interpreted. The cult of Ariadne and her disappearance. Ariadne, daughter of the Cretan king Minos, entered mythology as the one who helped Theseus defeat the Minotaur and escape the labyrinth with a ball of thread. But her fate after this event is shrouded in mystery. In some versions, she died. In others, she was abandoned by Theseus on the island of Naxos, and in others, she became the wife of the god Dionysus. It was this last version that gave rise to one of the most mysterious cults of ancient Greece, where Ariadne turned from a mortal woman into a deity associated with the mystery of death and rebirth. The cult of Ariadne had a dual nature. On the one hand, she was revered as a goddess of marriage and fertility, symbolizing the union of the earthly and the divine. On the other hand, in some regions, especially on the Aegean Islands, Ariadne was perceived as a goddess of death and the underworld. Her festivals included elements of mourning. Participants mourned her as dead and then celebrated her resurrection. Such a rite clearly pointed to an archaic cult of a dying and resurrecting deity, similar to Eastern religions. On the island of Naxos, where, according to the myth, Theseus abandoned Ariadne, her cult was especially strong. There were two festivals there, one called Sacred Marriages and depicted the union of Ariadne and Dionysus. The other was mournful and dedicated to her death. These rites combine joy and sorrow, wine and crying, dancing and silence. The priests explained that Ariadne united two sides of existence, life and death, love and loss. Ancient authors noted that her cult was closely connected with wine and ecstasy. This is not surprising, since Dionysus was considered her husband. However, unlike the purely Dionysian mysteries, the cult of Ariadne had a more feminine and intimate character. It was attended mainly by women who played out scenes of her abandonment and grief. These rituals were not simply theatrical. They expressed the experience of loss and the hope for rebirth that came through divine union. But there were also disturbing and dark elements in the cult. In some places it is mentioned that, in honor of Ariadne, sacrifices were made not only of wine and flowers, but also of animal blood. Perhaps these were the remains of an older rite, where the goddess demanded sacrifices for the transition between worlds. Her disappearance became the central theme of mythology. Some believed that she died of melancholy on Naxos. Others believed that Dionysus took her and made her immortal, but no version gave a definitive answer. This double existence of Ariadne, between death and eternal life, became a symbol of the cult itself. She was a goddess who simultaneously disappeared and returned, died and was resurrected. Philosophers and poets saw a profound symbol in her image. For Plutarch, Ariadne was the embodiment of the soul, wandering in the labyrinth of life and looking for a way out. For the Orphics, she became the divine companion of Dionysus, guiding souls through the boundaries of the world. Thus, her disappearance and transformation into a goddess was explained as a mystical process of the transition of the human into the divine. Archaeological finds confirm the existence of her cult. Inscriptions and images have been found on Naxos and Cyprus, where Ariadne is depicted next to Dionysus. In some cases, she stands with a torch in her hands, as a guide to the world of the dead. In others, she holds a wreath, a symbol of marriage. These images show her dual nature and confirm that her worship was real and widespread. The mystery of Ariadne is that she was one of the few mortal women to be elevated to the rank of goddess. Her cult shows that Greek religion had a tradition of venerating not only the Olympians, but also heroines whose fates reflected universal human experiences: love, loss, death, and the hope of rebirth. Today, researchers argue about what exactly was hidden behind her image. Some see her as simply a mythical character elevated to a cult. Others believe that Ariadne was originally an ancient goddess who was later humanized by the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. Her image retains features of the Eastern cults of Ishtar or Astarte, goddesses associated with love and death at the same time. Her disappearance remains a symbol of mystery. No one knows whether she died a mortal woman or became the immortal wife of Dionysus. But it is precisely this uncertainty that makes her cult so attractive. It suggests that even in the world of gods and myths, there is room for a riddle that can never be fully resolved. And perhaps this is precisely where its power lies. Ariadne, lost and reborn, has become an eternal image of human destiny. We all wander in a labyrinth, looking for a way out, losing and finding, dying and being reborn in memory, myth, and eternity. Mysterious diseases described by Hippocrates. The name of Hippocrates, who lived in the 5th century BC, has become a symbol of medicine. His oath is still considered the basis of medical ethics, and his works are the beginning of a scientific approach to treatment. But in the numerous texts that have come down to us under his name, there are references to diseases that affected the ancient Greeks, the origin of which remains a mystery even to modern researchers. These descriptions combine the observation of a doctor and the mysticism of the ancient world, where any ailment could be perceived as the intervention of the gods. One of the most mysterious diseases, which Hippocrates describes in detail, is the so-called sacred disease. Today we understand it as epilepsy, but in those days it was considered a manifestation of divine will. People believed that those who were struck by sudden attacks with loss of consciousness and convulsions were chosen by the gods or, on the contrary, cursed. Hippocrates claimed that the disease had natural causes related to the brain. However, his descriptions include cases that are difficult to explain. Patients could see visions, hear voices, or smell unusual odors in anticipation of an attack. These details give the disease a mystical hue and make one wonder whether there was something more behind it than just a physiological ailment. Another mysterious disease was the mass outbreaks of black fevers. Some of Hippocrates' texts describe epidemics in which people suddenly fell ill with high fevers, accompanied by delirium, internal bleeding, and black discharge. Contemporaries believed that this was a punishment from Apollo, the god of healing and illness. Scientists speculate that these may have been outbreaks of typhus or plague, but the description is so unusual that there is no clear answer. What is especially strange is that the disease sometimes died down as suddenly as it began, as if it disappeared with a change in the winds or sacrifices to the gods. Hippocrates also mentioned mysterious mental disorders. He wrote about people who suddenly began to hear voices and see images that did not exist in reality. Sometimes these states were accompanied by incredible physical strength or, conversely, complete exhaustion. For the Greeks, this was a sign of possession. It was believed that a demon or a god was entering a person. Hippocrates tried to explain this by a disturbance of the humors of the body, but he himself admitted that the nature of these conditions was unclear. Modern researchers see in these descriptions manifestations of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but in antiquity such people became objects of worship or fear, and sometimes they were taken for prophets. No less mysterious were the illnesses that affected entire cities. One treatise mentions that in Athens and the Aegean Islands, illnesses sometimes arose that affected only women. Symptoms included sudden infertility, miscarriages, and severe bleeding. The men remained healthy. Hippocrates tried to explain this by the influence of air and water, but such selectivity still raises questions. Perhaps these were mass poisonings or infections associated with water. But in the eyes of the ancient Greeks, it looked like a curse of goddesses jealous of the beauty and fertility of women. Sleep-related illnesses are a particular mystery. Hippocrates wrote of people who could sleep for weeks, waking up only to eat some bread and then fall asleep again. Other cases describe night terrors in which patients screamed, fought with invisible enemies, and woke up in a cold sweat. These states were perceived as the intervention of the god of sleep, Hypnos, or night demons. The doctor tried to find physical explanations, but admitted that the mystery of sleep remained incomprehensible. Hippocrates also recorded cases of unusual physical transformations. In one of his texts, he mentions people who suddenly lost limbs for no apparent reason, or developed strange tumors that would disappear and then return. For the Greeks, these were clear signs from the gods or harbingers of disaster. Modern doctors suggest that these could have been autoimmune diseases or cancer, but it is impossible to give a definitive answer. Another mystery was the diseases associated with certain places. Hippocrates wrote that in some cities people suffered from constant headaches and weakness, while in neighboring villages everyone was healthy. He linked this to water and climate, but did not rule out the influence of the breath of the earth. Perhaps these were manifestations of underground vapors or toxins, but for the inhabitants it was proof that the earth itself could punish or pardon. What is striking about these descriptions is that Hippocrates, being a doctor, sought to find natural explanations, but at the same time did not deny the mystical side of diseases. It was important for him to show that illness is not always a purely physical ailment. It can be associated with lifestyle, place of residence, and state of mind. But at the same time, he recorded phenomena that went beyond the scope of conventional medicine and still seem mysterious. The mysterious diseases described by Hippocrates remain a bridge between science and mysticism. They remind us that medicine was born in a world where man lived side by side with gods and spirits. And although we can explain many of these ailments today, there are still cases that elude science and retain an aura of mystery. For the ancient Greeks, illness was not just physical suffering, but a sign. It could mean the wrath of the gods, foretell wars or catastrophes, or point to the guilt of an entire city. And Hippocrates, even while striving for rationality, retained respect for this mystical side. His texts are not only medicine, but also a mirror of the beliefs, fears, and hopes of an entire people. And perhaps that is why they are still read with a shudder. In them we see not only the first steps of science, but also the eternal fear of man before a mysterious illness that cannot be fully explained. The Curse of Cassandra, a prophetess no one believed. Among the many tragic figures of ancient Greek mythology, the image of Cassandra remains one of the most mysterious and painful. The daughter of Priam, the king of Troy. She had the gift of prophecy, which fate itself turned into a curse for her. Her words were clear and precise, but no one believed in her predictions. This story has become a symbol of despair when truth is powerless and knowledge turns into an instrument of suffering. And behind this image lies not only a myth, but also a deep mystical idea that has troubled the minds of poets, philosophers, and historians for centuries. According to legend, Cassandra received the gift of prophecy from Apollo. The god of light and foresight was inflamed with passion for her and promised to grant her the ability to see the future if she became his lover. Cassandra agreed to accept the gift, but then refused Apollo's love. The angry god could not take away what had already been given, but imposed a curse. From now on, all her words would be true, but no one would believe them. From that moment on, her life turned into a chain of horrors, to see the future and know that it is impossible to prevent it. Cassandra's most famous prophecy is connected with the Trojan War. She warned that the wooden horse left by the Greeks at the city walls was fraught with destruction. She begged them not to bring it inside, predicting blood and fire, but her words only caused ridicule. The people of Troy considered her mad, and the warriors dragged the horse into the city in the name of triumph. That same night, the warriors emerged from its womb, and Troy fell. Thus, Cassandra became a witness to her own rightness, but also to her own impotence. Cassandra's tragedy was not limited to the Trojan War. After the destruction of her home city, she fell into the hands of Agamemnon and was taken to Mycenae. There she again predicted the death of the king and her own death at the hands of Clytemnestra. Her words sounded like a cry of despair, but again, no one believed her. When the prediction came true, her body was left lying next to Agamemnon's, and even in death, she did not find justice. The mystery of Cassandra's curse is that it combines a gift and a punishment. She embodies a paradox. She had knowledge, but it became a source of pain, not salvation. For the Greeks, this story had the deepest meaning. It showed that even truth has no power without trust. The truth may be clear, but if people are not ready to accept it, it becomes an empty phrase. Cassandra became a symbol of the prophet's madness. Her appearance was often described as frantic, her hair disheveled, her eyes fixed on the distance, her voice broken by screams. It was the image of a person who has more revealed than others, but whose knowledge destroys her own soul. Ancient playwrights loved this motif because it showed that even a gift from the gods can turn into horror. From a philosophical point of view, Cassandra's curse has become a symbol of human destiny. People often know what awaits them in the future: death, destruction, suffering. But they still live as if it will not happen. The warnings of reason are ignored, as Cassandra's words were ignored. This myth shows that the tragedy of human nature is not only ignorance, but also the unwillingness to hear the truth. Archaeologists and historians point out that the cult of Cassandra existed in some regions of Asia Minor. She was revered as a heroine prophet, with sacrifices being made to her in the hope of receiving clairvoyance or protection. This confirms that her image was not just a literary, but also a religious symbol. Perhaps in her cult, people saw the opportunity to turn to a force that knows the truth, even if it is difficult. Modern psychologists sometimes use the term Cassandra syndrome to describe a situation in which a person sees danger or senses trouble, but their warnings are ignored. This image lives on today because it is universal. Anyone who has ever experienced distrust of their own words can relate to this ancient prophetess. The mystery of Cassandra's curse remains relevant today. Her story reminds us that knowledge alone does not save. Trust is needed, a willingness to hear and accept the truth. Without it, even a prophecy becomes a cry in the void. For the ancient Greeks, Cassandra was a symbol of the inevitability of fate and the helplessness of man before fate. For us, she has become an image of the tragic loneliness of someone who knows too much. Her voice, reflected in myths and tragedies, sounds even after thousands of years, reminding us that sometimes the worst fate is not ignorance, but knowledge that no one believes. The mystery of the sunken city of Pavlopitri. On the southern coast of the Peloponnese, near Cape Malleus, in the Aegean Sea, lies one of the greatest archaeological mysteries of Greece, the sunken city of Pavlopetri. Its discovery in the 20th century was a sensation. It is one of the oldest known submerged cities in the world, dating back more than 5,000 years. But in addition to its historical value, Pavlopetri is shrouded in an atmosphere of mysticism. Its streets, houses, and squares, lying under a thick layer of water, seem to have frozen in time, turning into a kind of portal to an era that has long since disappeared. The city was discovered in 1968 by the British archaeologist Nicholas Fleming. Using scuba gear, he discovered underwater remains of stone structures, paved roads, and rectangular outlines of buildings. Later studies confirmed that these were not just random ruins, but a whole planning complex with streets, blocks, wells, and even stone tombs. Pavlopetri existed long before the heyday of classical Greece in the early Bronze Age. The biggest mystery is how and why the city ended up underwater. Archaeologists believe that tectonic movements and earthquakes lowered the coastline below sea level, but local myths had other explanations. It was believed that the city was cursed by the gods for its pride and therefore went into the sea. These legends echoed the myth of Atlantis, and many considered Pavlopetri to be a little Atlantis that preserved the secret of the destruction of entire civilizations. Interestingly, Pavlopetri has preserved traces of not only residential buildings, but also religious buildings. Researchers have discovered the foundations of sanctuaries and stone altars. This indicates that the city had a developed religious life. Perhaps it was here that rituals associated with the sea took place, since the inhabitants were constantly dependent on it. According to one version, underwater rituals could have played a special role. Priests made sacrifices to sea gods to protect the city from disasters. But if so, their efforts did not save it from destruction. The disappearance of the inhabitants themselves also remains a mystery. When exactly they left the city and where they went is unknown. Archaeologists have found no traces of mass graves or signs of panic flight. Everything looked as if people simply disappeared, leaving their homes. This has increased the mystical aura of Pavlopetri. Some believe that its inhabitants could have perished as a result of a sudden cataclysm. Others, that they left in advance, anticipating trouble. Modern research using 3D modeling has made it possible to reconstruct the appearance of the city. Now, we can see what its streets, houses, and squares looked like. But the more scientists learn, the more questions arise. Why did such an early civilization build such complex cities? Why did such a center arise here? And why is it almost completely forgotten in myths, even though it existed for thousands of years? Pavlopetri still excites the imagination of not only scientists, but also mystics. Divers who dive to its ruins tell of strange sensations, as if there is a special silence under the water, unlike other places. Some claim to have heard a hum or seen shadows resembling silhouettes of people wandering the streets. Of course, this can be explained by the play of light and acoustics, but such stories make the city look like a place where the border between the past and the present is thinner than anywhere else. For the ancient Greeks, the seas and oceans were always a source of mystery. In their myths, the sea could both give life and take it away. Pavlopetri became a real embodiment of these ideas. Its fate reminds us that civilizations can disappear in an instant, leaving only ruins on the seabed. Today, Pavlopetri is included in the list of cultural heritage, but it remains a mystery. Archaeologists continue to study it, but many questions remain unanswered. Why did people leave? Was it a consequence of a catastrophe or a decision of the inhabitants themselves? Why did the memory of the city almost disappear from traditions? The mystery of Pavlopetri is that it combines myth and reality. We see real stones, streets, and houses, but we do not know their history. We know that people lived there, but we don't know why they disappeared. In this sense, Pavlopetri is the ancient Atlantis, a small fragment of the great mystery of how even the most advanced cities can dissolve in water and become a legend. And perhaps this is precisely where its mystical power lies. Pavlopetri reminds us that civilizations are not eternal, that the sea holds secrets that cannot be fully explained, and that every dive into its waters is not just archaeology, but an encounter with the shadows of the past, the mystical cult of Hermes as a guide of souls. The image of Hermes in ancient Greek mythology seems at first glance light and even playful. He was known as the god of trade, cunning, and paths, the patron of travelers and thieves, the messenger of the Olympians. But Hermes had another, much darker hypothesis, which not everyone knew about. He bore the title of Psychopomp, the guide of the souls of the dead to the afterlife. It is this side of the cult of Hermes that remains one of the most mysterious because it connects the cheerful trickster with the terrible guardian of the border between life and death. Ancient sources say that Hermes accompanied the souls of the dead to the banks of the Acheron River, where they were met by Charon and transported to the kingdom of Hades. But his role was not limited to this. He could ease the soul's passage, make its path less painful, or, on the contrary, deprive it of protection, leaving it alone and vulnerable. In the hymns to Hermes, there are lines where he is called the one who leads along the road unknown to the living. This shows that his cult had a deep mystical meaning. Priests and philosophers often spoke of Hermes as a mediator. He connected the world of gods and the world of men, but also the world of the living and the world of the dead. This duality made him especially important in rites of passage. In some parts of Greece, there were secret rituals in which Hermes was invoked specifically as Psychopomp. People made sacrifices to him at roads and crossroads, places that were considered symbols of choice and transition. At such crossroads, herms were erected, stone pillars with the image of Hermes' head. These modest monuments were not only symbols of fertility and trade, but also amulets for the souls passing by. Hermes' mystical role was also manifested in dreams. It was believed that he could come to people in their dreams to warn them of danger or to show the way to a deceased soul. Some texts mention that priests used special spells, calling upon Hermes to allow them to see the world of the dead. These practices bring his cult closer to necromancy, which existed in Greece on the borders of official religion. Hermes' connections with magical practices were especially mysterious. In the Orphic tradition, he was called the keeper of secret knowledge. It was believed that he was the one who gave people the art of communicating with spirits and taught priests the words that opened the gates between worlds. In some texts, his name is associated with Hermetic secrets, which later formed the basis of the esoteric teachings of late antiquity. But perhaps the darkest side of the Hermes cult is connected with the death rituals. In some places in Greece, the dead were buried with small figurines of Hermes or inscriptions with his name. This was done so that the god would take the soul under his protection. People believed that if Hermes turned away, the soul could get lost and not find the way to Hades. It was considered especially terrible to die without the ritual of calling Hermes. Then the soul was doomed to eternal wandering. Archaeological finds confirm this practice. Small amulets with the image of Hermes and sometimes the inscription, "Be a guide," were found in graves. Such finds indicate that even in simple burials, people sought to enlist the support of this god. He was not just a mythological character, but a real force to which they turned at the most terrible moment of human life, the moment of death. The enigma of Hermes, the psychopomp, is further enhanced by the fact that he was a figure who bridged the gap between light and darkness. He could be playful and cheerful, but he was the one who met souls at the borders of worlds. For the Greeks, this was a reminder that death is not an end, but a journey, and that every journey has its own guide. Hermes was the one who could pass through boundaries that others found insurmountable. Philosophers saw him as a symbol of transition. The Pythagoreans and Orphics claimed that the soul made a long journey after death, and Hermes symbolized the knowledge necessary for this journey. He was the one who possessed the secret path, and therefore his cult was associated not only with religion, but also with the search for truth. Modern researchers believe that the image of Hermes as a guide of souls has parallels in other cultures. In Egypt, this role was played by Anubis, and among the Romans, by Mercury. Perhaps this is a reflection of the universal human idea that death is a transition, and someone must accompany the soul on its final journey. But for the ancient Greeks, Hermes was more than just a symbol. His name was uttered at the bedside of the dying. His image was placed in tombs. His statues were erected at crossroads. His cult was a reminder that no one goes to the underworld alone. Even if friends and family are left behind, Hermes accompanies everyone. This mystical role makes Hermes one of the most mysterious gods of antiquity. He was both light and dark, both cheerful and scary. His cult reminds us that the border between life and death is always thin, and somewhere on it stands a guide, ready to lead us further. The mystery of Hermes the psychopomp lives on. His image continues to excite because he embodies the deepest human need, not to be alone at the moment of death. And in this sense, the cult of Hermes remains relevant. It tells us that even in the most terrible secret, In the secret of death, there is a presence and accompaniment. The shadows of the priests of Olympia and their secret rites. Olympia is known throughout the world as the birthplace of the Olympic Games, a celebration of strength and harmony dedicated to Zeus. The marble temples, stadium, and altars became a symbol of the greatness of ancient culture. But behind this facade of celebration, there was another, darker side. The secret rites of the priests, which were carried out for centuries away from the eyes of spectators. These rites, of which only fragments of information have survived, gave rise to legends about the shadows of Olympia, mysterious figures who connected the world of people and gods. The priests of Olympia had a special status. They were not just temple servants, but guardians of rituals, the meaning of which was often hidden even from the participants of the games. According to ancient authors, 3 days before the start of the Olympic Games, closed rites were held in the sacred grove of Altis, where the priests called upon Zeus and other gods. Sacrifices were made there, but not always only of animals. Some texts mention that in ancient times human sacrifices could be used, brought to appease the sky and ensure the favor of the gods for the festival. A special place was occupied by the sacrificial altar of Zeus, built not of marble, but of ashes. Every year, hundreds of bulls were brought there, and their blood was absorbed into the earth. Over time, a huge black pile of ashes formed, which itself became an altar. But they said that at night, when everything was quiet, the priests gathered at this altar and performed rituals that no one dared to talk about. Witnesses claimed that on such nights strange sounds were heard in the air, like the hum of a distant choir, and the smell of sulfur was felt. Legends speak of shades of priests that were said to appear during these rituals. They were described as figures in long white robes, with hoods covering their faces. Sometimes they were said to be the spirits of the former priests themselves, returning from Hades to take part in the rites. To the locals, this was proof that there was activity going on at Olympia that went beyond the realm of ordinary religion. The rituals associated with the athletes' oaths also remained mysterious. Before the games, athletes swore oaths in the temple of Zeus, but the priests read special spells over them. Ancient texts mention that if an athlete broke the rules, he suffered a terrible fate. He fell ill or died shortly after the games. For the Greeks, this was the work of the gods, but some scholars suggest that the priests could have used secret knowledge about poisons or psychotropic substances. No less mysterious were the prophetic practices of Olympia. In the temple of Zeus, there was an oracle, less known than the Delphic one, but respected. It was said that the priests could interpret lightning and the movements of birds, but some legends mention that they used more sinister methods. They sacrificed animals, and sometimes people, to predict the outcome of games or wars. These prophecies were available only to a narrow circle of initiates. Archaeological excavations confirm that Olympia was not only a sports center, but also a place of intense religious activity. The layers near the temples contain remains of sacrificial fires, vessels with blood and wine residues, and tablets with curses. All this indicates that the official religion here was intertwined with secret rituals, many of which were hidden from the people. Contemporaries had different attitudes towards these rituals. For some, it was evidence of the power of the gods and the grandeur of Olympia. For others, it was proof that the priests possessed dangerous knowledge and used it to control people. Philosophers such as Plato wrote that religious rites often served not the gods, but those who controlled them. But even they acknowledged that the secret practices of Olympia had real power because they inspired fear and awe. The mystery of the Olympian shadows is that they remain on the border between myth and history. We know that sacrifices and divination took place there, but we do not know what secrets were hidden behind the closed doors of the temples. We hear stories of priests who turned into shadows, but we cannot distinguish truth from legend. Today, when tourists visit Olympia, they see only ruins, the stone foundations of temples, the remains of a stadium, columns that have fallen to the ground. But for those who know the legends, these stones hold more than memories of sports games. They hold traces of mysterious rituals that link the living with the dead, people with gods, and history with mysticism. And perhaps this is the main secret of Olympia. The great festival, which glorified the strength of body and spirit, was not only an arena for athletes, but also a place where priests performed actions available only to the chosen ones. The shadows of Olympia remind us that behind any light, there is always darkness. And it is this that gives greatness a special depth and anxiety. Mysterious sounds heard in the ruins of Delphi. Delphi, the Sacred Heart of ancient Greece, has always been considered a place where man could touch the will of the gods. Here was the Temple of Apollo, the famous oracle whose words guided kings and cities. Pilgrims from all over Hellas and even from other countries flocked here. But along with the prophecies of Pythia, along with the splendor of the temples and sanctuaries, Delphi also preserved another secret. Strange sounds that, according to evidence, could be heard in their ruins, and even in those times when the complex was still active. These sounds gave Delphi a special mystical aura and made people believe that here, at the foot of Parnassus, the earth itself speaks to man. Ancient authors mention that there were underground cracks in the Temple of Apollo from which gases emanated. It was these cracks that were believed to plunge Pythia into a trance. But at the same time, people heard strange voices, echoes, and hums in the halls and corridors that could not be explained by wind or echo alone. Some believed that these were the sounds of the spirits of the underworld themselves. Others claimed that these were the voices of the gods coming from the depths. There is a story that during particularly important fortune-telling, sounds similar to a choir were heard. Witnesses claimed that they heard harmonious voices, although there were no singers in the temple. These songs were perceived as signs of the presence of divine forces. There were even more frightening stories. Travelers who spent the night near the temple said that they heard screams and groans, as if from underground. After this, many fell ill or died, and local residents said that these were souls imprisoned under the temple, calling for sacrifices. Archaeologists and historians today explain these phenomena from a scientific point of view. Delphi is located in a seismically active zone, and underground faults really do make sounds. Gases coming out of the cracks could cause hallucinations in people, including auditory ones. But even taking these explanations into account, the coincidence remains strange. Stories about mystical sounds are repeated over the centuries and in different sources. The mystery is compounded by the fact that sounds continued to be heard even after the temple complex was destroyed. In late antiquity, when the temple was no longer in use, travelers still reported strange echoes and hums in the ruins. Medieval pilgrims passing by claimed to hear groans and whispers coming from the ruins at night. Even in modern times, when archaeologists began to study the ruins, some of them noted unusual acoustics and strange noises that defied explanation. Local legends say that these sounds are the voices of the Pythias, which still resound in the stones. It was believed that the priestesses, who prophesied in a trance, left part of their souls in the temple, and now their whispers continue to address people. Others believe that it was Apollo himself, whose presence in Delphi never fades. There are also darker versions. Some ancient researchers believe that spirits or even souls of those sacrificed were imprisoned under the temple. It was their groans that were heard at night. This version is supported by the finds of bones and objects in underground pits under the temple. Of course, they could simply be the remains of sacrificial animals, but legends turn them into evidence that the temple stands on a place of power, where the border between the worlds is especially thin. Modern scientists who have studied the acoustics of Delphi do indeed note unusual properties. Even a small sound can be amplified many times there and return as a strange echo. If you add to this underground noises and fumes, an atmosphere arises that could easily give rise to legends. But it is impossible to dispel them completely because the subjective experience of witnesses is too vivid and repeats itself from century to century. The mysterious sounds of Delphi are not just an acoustic phenomenon. They are part of the mystical experience that made this place sacred. For pilgrims, they were confirmation that there were forces here that could speak to man. For us, they remain a symbol of how nature and faith intertwine into a single mystery. Today, tourists visiting Delphi often talk about the strange silence that reigns here. It is not like the usual silence of the mountains. It is filled with anticipation, as if the stones are ready to speak at any moment. And perhaps this feeling is a continuation of the very mystery that has accompanied this place for thousands of years. Delphi remains a place where the sounds of the past and present merge into one. And in this mystical symphony, man hears again and again a voice that reminds him, the truth can be hidden in the whisper of the wind, in the hum of the earth, in an echo that belongs to no one. Whatever the subject, ancient Greece always appears to us not only as the cradle of philosophy and art, but also as a land where darkness and light intertwined in eternal mystery. Orphic hymns, sunken cities, prophecies, and curses remind us. Antiquity holds secrets that are not subject to either time or reason, and perhaps it is precisely in this mystery that its eternal power lies.